Hey everyone, Miss Orth here. I'm so sorry I had to reschedule, so I know that might have changed who could attend tonight or not. But anyways, I just have a couple of things to cover with you before we get started. Some housekeeping things. It's finals week next week. It's the end of the end. You have to complete your final in order to pass course. If you don't take your final, you get a 10%. So all of that work would have been for nothing. So don't forget to take your final. If it's proctored, you need to get a hold of your site coordinator and figure out a time that they can give you the password and proctor you. If it's non-proctored, make sure you take your time to answer those questions with details. And you shouldn't use AI for it. I want your own words and your best details. And unit folders are all still open. So keep submitting stuff. You can redo assignments. You can make up missing work. You can retake tests and quizzes. Don't forget that. Class ends next Friday at 5 p.m. If you're like, I need more time to get my grade up, you can file an extension. And that's in the yellow folder in your unit review, which I'll show you on the next slide. And then if you want to fill out surveys about me, that's in 15 extra credit points. This is what your yellow folder looks like at the end of course items. It tells you about your final. It tells you that there's a part for the survey. And then if you need to do the extension, there's this extension request form that goes to your site coordinator. They approve it. It comes to me. And then you can get extended time. That's up to 2 weeks. So don't forget about that if you need it. So we had 8 units. 1, evolution, natural selection. 2, evolution of populations. 3, history and diversity of life. 4, form and function. 5, individual and community ecology. 6, population ecology. 7, the biosphere. And 8, human impact. So what are the differences between a hypothesis, theory, and law? So fact is like a stated observation. A hypothesis is a one that you're going to be able to test. You're going to kind of predict something. Everybody calls it an educated guess. But a law or principle is a description of something that you can see. It summarizes the relationship between variables in a system, whereas a theory is a well-supported explanation for a series of observations that have taken place. So hypothesis, you try to prove someone wrong. You can do this experiment multiple times and potentially get different results. Laws and theories usually want the same results over and over and over again. So unit 1, natural selection and artificial selection. Natural selection is always said as survival of the fittest, which is basically you have the favorable traits that allow you to reproduce and continue on spreading your genetics. And that's where genetic variations can occur is within natural selection. Artificial selection is when humans go choose what traits that they want specifically. Sometimes this happens for dog breeders when you're looking for traits. For example, I have a Weimaraner, and the breeder really wanted some droopy lips. And so he kept breeding the Weimaraners with the droopiest lips, and now my Weimaraner has some droopy lips. So there's different traits you can select for. It's not just in dogs, though. And sometimes biologists use artificial selection to help save populations in certain areas around the world and in zoos and things like that. Evolution, the definition is when there are changes in characteristics of populations living over time. So keyword, over time. There's a lot of misconceptions, and I don't know if you guys remember the discussion board about misconceptions, but that's a view or opinion that's incorrect because of a misunderstanding about a complex issue. So people who eat sushi eat raw fish. Well, sushi does not only mean raw fish, and there's not only sushi dishes that are only fish. There's a lot of different options, so that's considered a misconception. One question on there is about homologous and analogous traits. Homologous structures are similar in organisms that share ancestors. So that's the whole key with homologous is that they share ancestors. And so for example, mammals, whereas analogous structures are different species. They don't have a common ancestor, but they need the same type of adaptation or structure to survive. So the good example on the picture would be bird wings, insect wings, and bat wings. They all need to fly, but they don't share a common ancestor. But cats and us, ironically, we share a common ancestor. All right, Unit 2, evolution of populations. There's different types of evolution. One that's super common is divergent evolution. That's where you share a common ancestor and become two different types of species. Whereas convergent evolution, you have species with similar characteristics, but they do not share a common ancestor. And then one of our discussion boards was over coevolution. And that's where things evolve kind of together. And a really good example of this is birds and monarchs. And there's been species that actually have evolved to look like the monarch and pretend that they're poisonous, but they're really not. So they could survive the birds. So that's coevolution. Speciation is a group of individual organisms that interbreed and produce fertile, viable offspring. So that's a species, where speciation is the formation of two species from one original species. So they break off. Two common types, allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric is with a geographic barrier. So if you have like an island and there's a mountain between it, or there's water areas that they can't fly. Whereas sympatric, a new species kind of gets isolated, but they're not necessarily with a geographic separation. Lots of different types of sexual selection. There's stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. Stabilizing favors the average traits in a population. It reduces variation, which sometimes could be good and bad. It selects against extreme traits, so it kind of makes everything, let's say, like blend in more, so that they survive better. There's directional selection. That is when one extreme trait is favored over others. And so that trait kind of continues with the genetic pool, and a population will move with that extreme trait. And then disruptive favors individuals at both extremes. So one end of the scale to the other end scale. So that kind of leads usually to different distributions. It can cause species to split into a different species just based on a little bit of different similarities. One option or one example of that could be certain birds, a population of birds where some have really small beaks and some have really large beaks, just depending on the food sources that they have. And this is actually what Darwin saw with the finches. All right, founder's effect versus bottleneck effect. The founder's effect is when a small group breaks off from a larger populations and it forms a new population, and that gene pool is different at the end than the original one. An example of that is a few birds are blown to a remote island by a storm and start a new population, which might develop unique traits due to the limited genetic diversity of the initial founders. So basically, there's not a lot of diversity for those species to breed. And so kind of genetics stay very similar in that population. Whereas the bottleneck effect is where a large population suddenly reduces to a super small number. That means that they lose a lot of the genetic variation. So then they have a kind of a limited pool of genes with the reproductive gene pool. And so an example of this is if we have like a severe drought and there's a lot of deer in a forest, and then all of a sudden there's not a lot of food for them. And so some of the species don't survive. And so then there's just a few left, and those that are left are needing to reproduce and continue on. All right, Unit 3, History and Diversity of Life. Obviously, we know there's a fossil record. We have some really cool fossils throughout time. Fossils are preserved remains or traces of organisms that lived in the past. So soft parts of organisms almost always decompose quickly, but the hard parts, the bones, teeth, shells, actually remain long enough to mineralize and form fossils. And so this shows an image of an insect's wings. This was on one of your lessons. And the fossil record is a record of life that unfolded over 4 billion years and pieced back together. So we've looked at fossils throughout different ages of rocks and times and been able to see evolution through fossils, which is really cool. We have our geological time scale. It divides Earth's history into divisions, eons, eras, and periods that are based on major climate changes in geology, climate, and evolution of life. It organizes Earth's history and the evolution of life on the basis of important events. And so what you guys did was the time scale to look at the 5 major mass extinctions on your lesson. You'll need to know the hierarchy of classifications. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus. A lot of time we were talking about family genus within our work. And anyways, a really quick way to remember it, and this is what my science teacher taught me, was that King Philip came over for good spaghetti. So if you're wondering the order, King Philip came over for good spaghetti, and then we'll kind of help you figure it out. So this was the assignment that you did in class with the mass extinctions. We've had 5 mass extinctions. Asteroid impacts, global warming, glacial and interglacial episodes, rapid sea rises and drops, and massive volcanic activity. So you'll kind of, if you remember those 5 big peaks kind of in these areas, that will help you. And they're kind of talking about what's the big 6 mass extinction coming up soon, if it's coming up soon or not. Unit 4, form and function. You'll need to know the what cells are and how specialized cells represent the diversity of life. Everything starts off as a cell. Cells can combine then to form tissues. Tissues combine to form organs. Organs then have an organ system, and then we have an organism just like us. Homeostasis is a process in which organs work to maintain a stable internal environment. And that's a lot of times like referred to body temperature. So internal environments, there's 3 main components: receptors, the control center, and the effector. The goal of homeostasis is to maintain equilibrium around a point or a value called like a set point. So like your basics. While there are normal functions or fluctuations from the set point, the body system will usually attempt to go back to the point. So our internal body temperature, 98 degrees. So if anything veers off, then our bodies try to get back to 98 degrees. So for example, when you have a fever, you spike over 98 degrees, your body will try to bring you back down to that internal temperature. We talked a lot about positive and negative feedback loops. Positive feedback loops is when you have a response to an event increasing the likelihood of the event continuing. So one of the good examples that was used during class was nursing. And when babies nurse, the hormone prolactin is released, and then therefore the body makes more milk for the babies. One good example that we talked about for negative feedback loops was body temperature. Again, if you spike a fever, your body, if it's too hot, you're going to sweat. It's going to try to cool you down. And if you are too cold, your body's going to shiver, which is going to try to heat you back up. So that's negative. All right, Unit 5, individual and community ecology. Ecology is a study of how living things interact with each other and the environment. There's living and non-living factors, abiotic versus biotic. Biotic is living factors, where abiotic is non-living factors. And sometimes you can think of abiotic factors like Mother Nature is a really good way to think of that. All right, habitat and niche. You guys got this one right on all the assignments, which was awesome. So a niche, the role of an organism within its environment, and the actual habitat is the place or part of the ecosystem where the species or organism lives. A biome is a large, naturally occurring community of plants and animals that occupy a major habitat. There are 2 major groups of biomes, terrestrial and aquatic. We talked a lot about behavioral ecology, innate behaviors versus learned behaviors. This was an assignment too. Innate behaviors are what you're born with, reactions that you have. So the sucking reflex in infants when they're born, they just know how to nurse so they can get the nutrition that they need to survive. Whereas learned behaviors is like driving a car. It's teaching your dog to sit, ordering the bell to go outside. So things that humans teach them. All right, Unit 6, population ecology. We did quite a few assignments calculating population density, size, pyramids, etc. So population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same area. So population size is the number of individuals in a population. So for example, a population of insects might consist of 100 individual insects or many more. Population density is the average number of individuals in a population per unit of area or volume. So one way to calculate population density is to create a ratio of the number of individuals that live in a particular area to the size of the area. So if you had 100 insects that live in an area of 100 square meters, It has a density of 1 insect per square meter. If you're interested in ever being a biologist or wildlife biologist or marine biologist, you'd actually have to do these population density estimates, which is kind of fun. All right, population pyramids, lots of graphing for these assignments. So population growth is the change in the size of the population over time. An important factor in population growth is age, sex, structure. This is the number of individuals of each sex and age in the population. The age, sex, structure influences population growth. This is because younger people are more likely to reproduce, while older people have higher rates of death. This is true for animals, not just people. And some species don't live very long, so they reproduce at a younger age. And then some species live to be really old and reproduce at an older age. So age, sex, structure is represented by a population pyramid. Here's a picture of one. This one shows slow growth. If you look kind of the ages right here, you can kind of see that it's not really increasing very quickly. Carrying capacity is a big one. You have to figure out if that area can handle a certain population or a number. So it's basically the amount that can live in one area. So without with having all the things you need to survive. So sometimes populations will explode. They'll get really large in certain areas, and then there's not enough things to keep them alive, and so they'll die off. So over here you see the overshoot. So populations kept growing. All of a sudden they didn't have what they needed to survive, so they declined, but then they kind of came back, declined again. So really that carrying capacity lines in the center of the highs and lows, and that's really important to know for your final. There's population types. These are the two main ones that were talked about: R selected and K selected. R selected, they're really simple cognitively. They have a lot of food and resources. Sometimes you think of herbivores. They don't live super long, so their sexual maturity is really early on in life, and they reproduce with a lot of offspring. So a great example of R selected is a rabbit. And R and rabbit both start with R, so that helps you remember it. K selected is more complex cognitively. Sexual maturity is later in life, low offspring. So actually we as humans are in the K selected population type. There are population dynamics and regulations. Density dependent factors are competition, predators, parasitism, diseases. So that's really important to remember. So density dependent predators like the wolf. Density independent can also be known as like limiting factors, or mostly things that happen in Mother Nature. That would be unusual weather, natural disasters. For example, like in Idaho, if we have really long winters, it's really hard for some of our deer, certain species, to survive that long. If you're watching this recording, the way you get extra credit is you email me this phrase. All right, Unit 7, the biosphere. So we have producers, consumers, decomposers. This unit was pretty much review from previous science classes that you've had. Producers are organisms that make their own food. They use photosynthesis through sunlight, water, carbon dioxide. They're also known as autotrophs, and making your own food. Consumers are organisms that need to eat food to obtain energy. They cannot make their own food. These organisms are also called heterotrophs. And then we have decomposers, or organisms that get energy by breaking down or eating dead plants and animals. Energy flow, it's important to know where the energy flows. And it always flows to that top organism, the tertiary consumers. We have the secondary consumers. Then we have our primary producers, primary consumers, herbivores, that kind of first little area. And only, again, 10% makes it to that next level of energy from where they started, and you'll have some calculations on your final. There's actually 3 types of heterotrophs: carnivores, omnivores, and detritivores. And then of the 3, there's actually more than that. Flies, there's a lot of dung beetles, earthworms, snails, and crabs, depending on where you live. We have a lot of earthworms, so I'd like to point that out for your final. Some things that we need to talk about. There's a difference between a food chain and a food web. You guys were tasked to create a food web. And a food chain is just a linear sequence. Like energy just flows one direction through a couple species and then it's done. Whereas a food web is you have options. So it's really important to remember is food chain is more linear. There's trophic levels. The first trophic level is your producer. Again, it makes its own food. Plants make the food. Second trophic level is the primary consumer. It consumes producers. It eats the plants. So that's mice eat plant seeds. The third trophic level is the secondary consumer. It eats the primary consumer. So snakes eat mice. And then an example of that is our tertiary consumer. It eats your primary or your secondary consumer. And then so that would be example of hawks eating snakes. So that's kind of a breakdown of the trophic levels. Energy calculations, you have one on your final. So you just need to remember, you take your numbers and you times it by that 0.1, which is 10%, and that gives you your answer. But you have to do that for every level that you have. So if you see something like this and it says what's the final calculation or energy calculation by your tertiary consumers, you have to take 10,000 times by 0.1, you get 1,000. That's one level. Then you take 1,000 times it by 0.1, then you get 100, and you do it one more time to get your final answers, which should be 10 joules. All right, biodiversity. There's 3 types. That's the variety of life on Earth. There's a lot of genetic diversity, which is a variety of genes and traits that are available within a species. There's species diversity within an ecosystem, luckily. And then there's ecosystem diversity as well. So a lot of different types of habitats and areas. So yeah, that's Unit 7. Unit 8, human impact. I think one of the main things to focus on is there's CO2 that's natural, and then there's CO2 that's non-biogenetic. And that's something that Earth can't recycle. And so that's kind of the thing is like fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels, but what things can we recycle? What CO2 can recycle? And luckily we have trees that can help recycle some carbon dioxide, but some factory or fossil fuels that are burned through factories are non-biogenetic. And so that's the CO2 that we can't recycle. A pollutant is an undesirable factor that is added to the air, water, or soil. So any of those would be considered a pollutant. There's a lot of natural pollutants. If you didn't know, wildfires is actually a huge one. Volcanoes, lightning, it's just plasma, and then forests. We have cities. We have areas, farms. There's a hot topic about cows, fertilizers, oils, and gas. We have stationary, just industrial plants. And then we also have a lot of mobile pollutant emissions, cars, trucks, buses, motorcycles, airplanes. And one of the biggest contributors is actually like cargo ships and like cruise ships. All right, the greenhouse effect. Well, the greenhouse effect is where gases are absorbed and redirect heat radiated by Earth. And so it actually insulates it from heat loss to space. And some of the light that's hits Earth is reflected back into space, while the rest becomes heat itself. And so some gets trapped in the Earth, which causes Earth over time to heat up. This is natural. Like Earth goes through phases where it naturally heats up, and then also go through phases where it naturally cools down, like the Ice Age. So there's these cycles that naturally happen. And so that's important to know. The concern right now with the greenhouse effect is that humans are just speeding up the natural process. And that's, I think, scary to some people. All right, that is all. Good luck on your final. Please let me know if you have any questions at any time. My cell phone number's there. You can email me. Or if you need to schedule a virtual meeting, we can do that too. We only have 1 week left. So please let me know how I can help you. And thanks for watching.